Right. Well, in the interest of time, let us move to our last presenter for today. We're delighted to have Chiara Cooper, who's a PhD candidate in the law school at Edinburgh, who's going to present on some of her ongoing research. And the title of her presentation is Caught Between Desire and Danger, Power, Agency, and Emotion Work in American College Women's Heterosexual Lives. Chiara, delighted to have you with us and look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
That's probably best. So thank you to all the other speakers. That was really fascinating. And thank you to Ted for putting the event together. So my presentation is based on my PhD research, which I've recently submitted. And hopefully
there we go. Yep, we see it.
See that. That's good. Great. Thank you. So I'm going to kind of begin with a discussion of the aims and objectives of my research, and then I'll look to the questions that I sought to answer. I'll go into detail about how the research evolved and how it sits within the law school, and then I'll consider my methods both in a practical sense and analytically in terms of the data, and just finish up with a look to my findings. So crucially, my research pays attention to what is known about college-age women's heterosexual lives, and I attempt to generate knowledge as to their pleasures, their desires, the risks that they face, and their expectations and difficulties. So the principle of my research is to empirically shed light on the kind of nuanced and contradictory factors that form the environment of heterosexual women's stories, showing that crucially, heterosexuality for young women in my research seems to be marked by this persistent tension between desire and danger. So, given the rate of sexual assault on college campuses and building on existing research on young women's heterosexual lives, the main research objective of my research asks what can be said about college-aged women negotiating and navigating their heterosexual experiences with men. And then from this, I focus on three kind of sub-questions. The first, to what extent do women exercise a sense of agency and empowerment in their heterosexual lives? How do women cope with unpleasant sexual situations? And finally, what theoretical conceptual tools can be helpful to understand their experiences? And so both the current objective and the sub-questions shifted and developed until they were kind of fine-tuned in the final stages of the data generation process. And that was mainly during my focus group sessions. And despite the significant change in research focus, which I'll go on to explain here, the emphasis on young college-aged individuals' sexual lives and their pleasures and desires, the interplay of power within their experiences have all remained constant throughout my research focus. So considering how the research has developed over time, this project actually began as one which attempted to focus on understandings of sexual consent, particularly from a fraternity brother standpoint in the United States. So I was interested fundamentally in the cultural makeup of fraternities, wondering what it was about them as this quite powerful institution on college campuses, which contributed arguably to the high incidence rate of sexual assault, particularly after parties and events which they host. So my overall aim at the beginning was to understand how consent was reflected upon by young men in these fraternity groups, with a hope to kind of assess whether teachings and policies around sexual consent on college campuses, thinking specifically about affirmative consent policies and more no means no approaches, reflect the reality of how young men go about obtaining and practicing consent in their sexual lives. And so to do this, I spent 6 months at a large university in the south of the US for my field work. And as I said, I was keen to begin talking about the topic with fraternity brothers in a focus group setting. But access issues kind of forced me to change course because I came up against considerable pushback from fraternities, none of whom were willing to talk to me in the end. And I think it's worth kind of contextualizing that this fieldwork took place kind of at the height of the Me Too movement. So there was a lot of campus conversations happening around sexual consent, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. So fraternity men might have felt quite distrusting at that point in particular in time of outside researchers coming in and wanting to know their opinions on these topics. So that kind of meant that 4 months into my fieldwork, I had to consider my project and refocus my attention on young women in college. And I began a similar study in that the main questions and objectives remained the same. So my focus was on exploring sorority women in college and their understandings of sexual consent. And within this, I wanted to pay particular attention to this complex phenomenon of women consenting to unwanted sex. But over time, the study kind of developed and became a broader study which reflected the broader factors making up women's heterosexual lives. And this wasn't just from a sorority women's standpoint either. Women on campus more generally kind of heard of my work and then became associated with it and involved in the study. But focus groups remained a constant throughout the research process and was still my method of choice despite me having to change course. And in these focus groups, I was struck at how open the women were with me about topics beyond sexual consent. So, for example, of their pleasures and desires, their experiences of orgasm, the painful sexual episodes that they endured, their recognition of the inequalities in heterosexual relations, and the strategies that they would use to maintain kind of their sense of self and also their feelings of sexual empowerment. So at this point, I think it's important to consider how my research kind of sits within the law school. And I will say that this thesis did originate as a socio-legal one, as I said, which focused on women's experiences of consented to unwanted sex on college campuses. So I was thinking specifically here about how young women would label these unwanted but consented to experiences, whether they would reflect upon them as harms under the guise of the law using labels and descriptors like rape or sexual assault, or whether these instances were kind of tolerated, ambiguous acts that were quite difficult to describe and identify, but nevertheless a normalized part of their hetero kind of relations and activities, part of a continuum of sexual harms, for example, that they were forced to navigate. And though this is no longer the sole focus of my work, this thread of the story is still very much a part of the research. It just kind of makes up a larger tapestry of young women's heterosexual experiences, which are now contextualized by other stories and notions of power and pleasure, as well as this idea of emotion work. So in order to assess and analyse women's reflections of their heterosexual lives, as I said, I used focus groups as part of this project. There were 5 sessions in total conducted with 20 women at a large university in the US. And so here I was really keen to create an environment in the data collection process whereby a collection of voices and experiences and stories were heard. And because my interest centred upon women's reflections of their heterosexual lives as a group, isolating them from their social context, from their friends and from the university itself, for example, wouldn't have been appropriate. And so instead I saw focus groups to be a method which allowed an understanding to develop with regards to the social and cultural processes through which women's understandings and experiences of sex and relationships and consent were constructed. So I approached the focus groups in a semi-structured way with some pre-planned questions that I sought to follow and ask, and a very, very rough schedule that I wanted to follow as well. But as I said in the beginning, the discussions were quite lively and rich in detail. They usually exceeded the 1-hour limit that I had set myself and lasted 2 hours instead. And because of this rich discussion, kind of unforeseen areas of interest were brought to the conversation, a discussion of faking orgasm, for example, and the idea that young women quite complexly enjoyed providing pleasure to their partners, often cropped up. And these were themes that I had not anticipated and didn't really plan for, but they instead created a more organic process of data collection, as the topics that were being raised were ones that were of importance to the young women, and there was little influence from myself as an outside researcher. So as a consequence, the focus groups, I think, worked quite well because they provided a setting in which the women could kind of introduce their own concerns and beliefs as part of their heterosexual lives. And so I came to reflect on my conversations with the women as a sort of consciousness raising, which also came about in a very unplanned way. And what I mean by this is, in a group setting, women were sharing their lived experiences to uncover kind of shared truths or things that they might not have seemed collective. Often women said that these sessions were quite therapeutic for them as well. And some sexual stories, for example, ones of non-consensual condom removal, were shared and were initially reflected upon in quite unclear ways. One woman, for example, once she had shared her story of non-consensual condom removal, referred to it as her condom thing, and she found it quite difficult to convey the harm of the act to the group. She didn't really have the vocabulary to describe it, instead referring to it as something that was weird and bizarre. But as this particular conversation continued, with the support of the other women in the group, her story became a lot more clear, and she was able to really quite firmly label the harm that she felt as a result. She came to view the act of non-consensual condom removal as violating. And so I kind of reflected upon this particular episode and thought of it as a processing that took place, in that the weight of the harm of the act was recognised through her discussing it quite openly with the group. And so here women were uncovering harms that were often widespread and collectively shared. For example, nearly all women across my focus groups had experienced non-consensual condom removal, but this was quite shocking to them once they had begun these discussions. And it was my opinion that these commonalities might have gone unknown had we not had these group discussions, had I instead approached these topics from a one-on-one interview point. So using focus groups in the research offered the ability to access the language and vocabulary which the women would commonly use to describe their heterosexual experiences, but it also allowed for the women to analyse the conditions of their own lives and recognise collective problems that had otherwise seemed individualised or unimportant. So now I'm going to just quickly run through how I analysed the data. So I used both discourse analysis and narrative analysis, and I'll begin with discourse analysis first. And the discourse analysis used in my research is influenced by feminist scholarship. For example, the work of Nicola Gavey, who assumes that research participants' talk can be taken as illustrative of a range of discourses circulating in a particular place, time, and culture. And so here, analysing the ways in which heterosexuality is talked about and reflected upon helps us make sense of the cultural imperatives that might be silently or explicitly upheld, and highlights the ways in which this might be potentially resisted. So to do discourse analysis involves a careful rereading of texts, and in this case the transcripts of focus group interviews, with a view to discerning discursive patterns of meaning, contradictions and inconsistencies. So I was paying attention here to what the women in my focus groups were saying, how they were saying things, and the functions of their accounts. In other words, what the talk is doing and achieving. So it's a case of what's being said in the data, but also what's happening, whose voices are the loudest, who's interjecting and who isn't. So as part of this analysis then, I sought to explore what kind of discourses were present in the data to shed light on how female sexuality was constructed. And I found, for example, that discourses pertaining to the heterosexual double standard between male and female sexuality continued to exist in young women's lives. And this sexual double standard discourse was identifiable in the young women describing they were often shamed for having casual sex, and vocabularies like slut and whore were used reportedly by men to describe women who often had too much casual sex, for example. But it was also present too in the imperative that women position themselves as passive and receptive in sex, kind of in response to men's active sexuality. But it's also worth noting that some discourses opened up a space for an alternative, so a contradiction and a challenge to the dominant. In particular here, the women made use of a discourse which centered their sexuality, and they very much constructed female sexuality as positive at times, as healthy. They acknowledged their desires and their needs, and they explained that they found joy in casual sex. They enjoyed experimenting sexually to figure out what brought them pleasure. And they also encouraged and supported their friends in doing this too, should they want to. The women's awareness also of the unequal balance of heterosexual relations and the centering of male pleasure, for example, also constituted an acknowledgement of female desire and a resistance to these dominant sexual double standard discourses. So moving on to narrative analysis. Narrative analysis is set within human stories of experience and offers researchers a rich fieldwork to investigate the ways individuals experience the world depicted through their stories. So feminist narrative inquiry in the case of my work is embarked upon through the young women telling their stories and a writing up of these accounts. And here an ethical responsibility lies in listening and listening well to these stories, but in also pressing for them to be heard. So narrative analysis allowed for an understanding of stories relating to heterosexual women's pleasures, their desires, their fears and concerns in the most organic way. But most importantly, as the research is potentially sensitive in nature, narrative inquiry acted as the most respectful way to kind of honour the women's stories without interference from myself as a researcher. Narrative analysis, therefore, is a method which doesn't oppose assumptions onto the research participants' stories, but instead allows for a concentrated focus on their experiences, their feelings, and facilitating an emphasis on individual meaning making. So I'm going to kind of finish up this presentation by thinking about my findings. And as I've said, what we're kind of left with as part of my research and central to my thesis are different possibilities that, although might seem somewhat contradictory, do exist alongside one another as follows. And I've kind of hypothesized them into 4 separate sections, so I'll detail them in a little bit here. So the first is that young women deal with a dynamic of power that is both gendered and coercive, and this reveals itself in the young women reporting more contemporary and normalized sexual harms that they face in their lives. So for example, non-consensual condom removal and consented to unwanted sex here. And within these acts, a dynamic of male dominance and female subordination is at play, in that men are forcing women overtly and covertly to engage in unwanted sexual acts. Alongside this, and secondly, the young women are quite clearly adapting and adhering to very restrictive ideologies which dictate what it means to be a traditional feminine heterosexual woman and acceptable feminine behaviour. And so they report here that male pleasure is centered in the heterosexual space. They report also that they're sort of passive to their own sexual needs because of this male centering of pleasure. And they face a sexual double standard wherein the amount of sex that they have is suspect. Therefore, they face a kind of Madonna-whore dichotomy in that they're either pure and virginal and not having too much sex, or deemed promiscuous and easy if they explore their sexuality quite freely. In addition to this, though, the young women were able to kind of carve out some autonomy in these oppressive structures. For example, as I said, they disclose being able to sexually experiment at times, and they do find joy in the casual sex that they can have. Interestingly, this was complexly acknowledged in that they reported giving pleasure sometimes offers them a sense of power. They recognized how men's orgasm specifically was a space where they could shift the power dynamics. Men were in quite a vulnerable, subservient position in this space, and women were the providers of the pleasure, and therefore the holders of the power at that kind of very small, fleeting moment. And additionally, and finally, they engage in emotion work to cope with unpleasant sexual situations. And this work consists of them working on the self fundamentally. So they manage their own emotions as well as the emotions of men here, devising complex plans to preserve their physical and sexual safety. And this includes them tolerating and enduring sexual activities, consenting to some sexual acts, and taking part in a self-negotiation of sorts, where they ask themselves, what is it that I'm willing to tolerate sexually, and what is it that I'm willing to put up with? Because just saying no and rejecting men's sexual advances plainly is too dangerous and risks angering men. And it's men's anger that they're always kind of anticipating, they're always hyper aware of. So for the young women in my study, heterosexuality seemed to be quite a contested site. The women were afforded, albeit few, opportunities to disrupt power and access a very subjective form of sexual agency. But this still took place in an environment where traditional heterosexual discourses of gender and sexuality were still present to restrict the young women's subversions. So I kind of characterize the young women in my study to still be continuing to tread a very fine line between male power, these traditional heterosexual discourses, and their own sexual agency. And that's all the while that their heterosexual lives take considerable work to maintain.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Chiara. A lot of rich data clearly emerged from your PhD study.